It's a great honor to be here and to have the chance to present to you some of the recent work that we have developed in the office, and also to say having the chance to see this incredible city where so much has been happening in the last months. When I was told, actually by Olga, by email, that the topic of the festival was authenticity, I somehow felt that perhaps we were not the right person to deliver such a lecture. As in fact, many times in the past, our work has been accused of being kind of boring architecture. And despite such, in a way, accusation that we have never actually really took so much seriously, it is certainly true that we are at odds with a definition or a seeing of the work of the architect as the one of inventing, or the need, the one that has the need of always inventing something new, and to actually continuously generate this new form. And I would even say of the rather humiliating understanding of the role of the architect as the one of the one that needs always to invent something differently. Differently from such approach, we have actually now more or less 10 years of practice decided to completely bypass or avoid the problem of form, and we have done actually that in a quite strict and literal sense, to the point that all of our projects do refer to a very strict and limited formal vocabulary, which I could simplify and bring back to two figures, which are the square and the grid. And that, in effect, has allowed us to focus on what we believe is much more important today, which is, in fact, the need to see architecture as a social tool, as a tool of social advancement, and as a tool able to allow us to generate something that perhaps is more useful, to foresee, for example, unprecedented forms of cohabitation, of living, working, and to answer to those many unanswered questions that our society is today facing. Having said that, tonight I would present you with three projects which do belong to a common research that we are carrying on in our office since about a year on living, working, titled How to Live Together. The three projects that I will show you are actually three projects developed in different circumstances. The first and the last are two exhibition projects. One developed for the Biennale of Tallinn of last summer. The last one for Chicago for an exhibition which is now ongoing at the Art Institute in Chicago. And the middle project is a sort of self-commissioned project that we are doing for the city we are based in, which is the city of Brussels. Actually, this research on living, working was generated out of, let's say, a chance or a coincidence, when in the last few years we have been invited to take part in a few social housing competitions in Belgium, the upper part of Belgium, which is the region of Flanders, and in Switzerland. And at that time, we have first of all asked ourselves what social housing is today, and more profoundly perhaps, what does social mean in relation to our work? So the issue of social is actually a very recent notion which appeared in political theory only at the beginning of the 19th century with the advance of the first phases of industrialization. It is a notion that in fact ties people and the condition of production together, as in fact it is through the process of production, of the productions of their material life, that people come together in social relationship. So human beings are some creatures, some social creatures, you could say, that cannot survive and cannot meet their needs other than through cooperation and association. And cooperation and association are the very fundamental issue of production. And that for me, that talking about social today means to talk about production, about labor and work. And this issue of labor and work and their relationship to architecture and the contemporary city is in fact the topic that is at the center of our research. Of course, social has generated the political movement that we all know, which is socialism, which in fact before becoming ideology has attempted to promote the reform of society through the redistribution and reorganization of work. At that time, but before going into, in a way, the issue, there was this image by Jeff Ford, which perhaps some of you might know, Canadian photographer from 1978, which is called Young Workers. And it's an image that is quite important for us, as it's in fact, it represented this emergence of a new subject. As you can see, the young workers of Jeff Ford, which are in fact some of the artist's friends, Canadian friends, and they are photographers, architects, students perhaps, they are reproduced or portrayed in this picture through the iconography of social realism, but in fact we don't have anymore the worker as traditionally intended, either the factory worker or the blue-collar worker, but in fact the emergence of a new subject. A new subject which lacks in iconography, and that perhaps is even living conditions which are worse than the one of the worker that came before them. They earn less, they work more, and as we know in Europe today, they completely lack any social security. So in fact, in socialism, we know that the factory was a very central place where work was in a way exploited, where the workers were exploited. In a way, with the collapse of the material form of production and of the factory as a sort of means of the place where production was in a way developed, and with the rise of immaterial work as represented by the worker of the picture of the four, in a way we have the emergence of a new subject which completely lacks sort of political recognizability. It's also interesting that the factory, which perhaps in 20, 30 years ago were often transformed as the factory became available, they were not used as a place of production, as an office, as an art space, as a place for building new museum for contemporary art. Today, in a little bit like in this factory where we are here today, in a way factories are more or less, very often a place where these new subjects, these new young workers belonging to this sort of sphere of the material production, find or settle, establishing their living and working space. So in fact, the question that we're trying to answer with the research, and that the three projects that I will show try to, in a way, tackle, is how the factory, as a new form of domestic space, can be a project for the city of today. So before, actually, I will not try not to be very boring, but I will be very short. As I say, in fact, this is not just actually a project, but it's part of the research. And this issue of living and working within the same actually space is not something that is new to architecture. It's something that has crossed, in a way, the history of our discipline, and which in fact is perhaps pretty much tackled, especially in an example of the last 100th century, or 200 years. Nonetheless, it is certainly the monastery and the space where monks were living, and especially the mendicant monks, the place where, in fact, the first actually place where living and working were placed one next to each other. They were actually self-sufficient community most of the time, but also were the place where the individual cell, the single room, as we would say, was invented. But next to the individual room, there were a series of spaces which were actually choreographed around the central space, which were in fact giving form to the life of the inhabitants of the monastery. What is quite interesting is that actually to balance this need of seclusion and individuality that the monastery and the cell of the monastery was promoting, the cloister, which was placed at the center of this place, became a sort of place where in fact coexistence and meeting and gathering was somehow forced through the space of architecture. A second example, very briefly, that I would like to present is a very clear and famous example, is the phalanstery of Charles Fourier at the beginning of the 19th century. And although Marx was extremely critical towards this model, which was defined as utopian socialism, It's a model that, in fact, was very inspirational for many of the social housing projects that have been built not only in socialist countries, but also in the Western Europe. What is interesting for us about the Phalanstery is that, in fact, the idea of production has not only to do with material production, but in the Phalanstery, actually, the common space, which were the gallery that were bringing together the inhabitants of the single unit and the gardens, were in fact understood as place of production, as in fact social activities, and actually production called social activities, an entire spectrum of sounding life. So in fact already in the Phalanstery, in the idea of Fourier, production is not only material production, but is supported by in fact all the spectrum of activities of sound life. Very briefly again, an example that we would like to point out is the American Woman's Home by Catherine and Harriet Baker, which were two sisters, which in fact for the first time developed a new form of living and producing with the aim of liberating the subject, like the woman, that were repressing at that time, through in fact the project of domestic space. Domestic labor at that time has never been understood as a form of production, and in fact the woman was secluded in the house and traditionally put at the back, in the kitchen, in a sort of neglected space of this domestic space. The project actually that they developed was very interesting, in contrary to that, emancipating domestic labor, and they propose a new arrangement of domestic space, where in fact what you see is that at the center of the house they place the kitchen, the stove, the stair, all the infrastructure of the house, and all the rest is actually completely different from the traditional plan of the house of the apartment, as we cannot recognize anymore. Space for living, space for sleeping, space for gathering. In a way, it is a house, a sort of generic apparatus that through the mobile panels that you see at the corner of the kitchen can in fact acquire different functions. So in fact, the traditional way in which the apartment has been patterned to create a very strict and defined gender relationship does not exist anymore. And what is interesting is that the house on the outside looked like any traditional home of the time, but in fact the plan at the inside reveal a completely transformed idea of the house. Two other very important examples are the single cell by Ginsburg of 1930, in which in fact the idea of social, of the coming together of people was somehow liberated by the strict relationship given by family. In fact, single people would live everyone in one of these single homes, and would able to freely distribute and aggregate within the plan of the green city as it was imagined. And more interesting, the plan of the Dom Communa of Leonidov for the city of Magnitogorsk. Even more interesting somehow the radicality of the idea of collectivity as it was well known in the Dom Communa is transformed in a much more subtle way, where we are very individual space for the workers, a more collective gallery at the center, and then somehow small space where with potential of seclusion, of the possibility of a small-scale operation in the domestic space, a project that somehow anticipates clearly the contemporary need, as we've seen in some of the presentation before, of co-sharing, co-housing, and cohabiting. The last project, or anyway, part of this quick path through the history of living working space is represented by the Silver Factory of Andy Warhol in Manhattan in the 1960s. This was not the space of an artist, but actually was a space of the industrial producer. And Warhol understood, first of everyone else, that actually ex-factory, ex-industrial building could be used and become actually later very fashionable to artists. But that idea was actually not only a space for art producing, but was a space of encounter, was a space for living, actually for the many helpers that he had, and a place where the windows were always covered with dark curtain in order to so that there was no separation anymore between night and day, and where workers would be able to work 24 hours a day. The productive apparatus, in this case, is not anymore the machine, as in the factory, but became the people inhabiting the space. So these few examples that we very briefly have sketched on actually this tradition of living working form a little bit the theoretical background, which we became very interested when we were looking at the contemporary form of production and the rise of this new subject that had been described before. So in the project, the first project that we did is a proposal for the city of Tallinn. It's a project that was developed in the occasion, as I said before, of the Tallinn Biennale of Architecture of last September. The topic of this exhibition was recycling socialism, and all of the team that were invited were given a building present in the city, building of the socialist tradition. And in our case, we were given the passenger pavilion of the train station, which is the little square, white square that you see in the upper part of this railway track that carries into the city. Instead of playing actually with this project of this entry pavilion and transforming that, we have decided to look just a few meters beyond that, where we actually discovered that this new condition of work starts to emerge also in that city, especially in those actually industrial buildings that you see contained within this actual triangle, which is formed by the railway track and by the road, where actually all the industries like this one are now transformed and inhabited by an emergence subject, by in fact many of the small young companies belonging to the paradigm of immaterial economy. So the idea of the project was therefore to, in a way, make this tendency, to in a way bring to light this tendency, what was happening there, and to in a way give that an architectural presence. So that by making this condition visible, we would also give the people that live there and work there perhaps a possibility of political organization. Despite the large scale of the project that you can clearly see from this image, in reality the project started from actually working on the single cell, which was a 6 by 6 meter room, which you see in this perspective, which is in fact a very generic space, organized by placing at the center of this room of a block, an infrastructural block, where toilet and bathroom would be located, on top of which a bed could be placed, and around which table for cooking and for living could be organized. The minimum itself is intended to, of course, establish a sort of new standard where one person, two persons could be accommodated, but also was intended to offer a space of seclusion, offering an important balance with extremely actually social life that post-40s workers are having. So in fact, living in a small cell was somehow balanced by the possibility of putting together a very collective space and a very individual and seclusive space, something that in fact the contemporary housing market is completely absent and not possible to be found. The intervention has a large scale, as I was saying. It's clearly that the passenger pavilion that were originally given to us became a sort of entry point for this large-scale machine to be inhabited. And the large scale has actually two main reasons to be so. One is conceptual, and one is perhaps more contextual. The conceptual reason is that, of course, we sort of believe that this way of living in the city need to be visible, need to somehow become a body, and becoming visible, this new sort of consciousness of this emerging subject will become possible. This new structure also represents the idea that, in fact, this subject, which is devoid of any support, of any kind of welfare condition, would in fact propose or advance the idea of welfare, which in fact, where people could be given the space to live in one of these many cells that are present in this building, in exchange, for example, of a small rent, or in exchange, for example, of activities that the social worker could offer to the city, making this place not just a sort of dormitory, but a place that could be inhabited and open to the city and other users. The other reason for which actually the building is so big is, as I said, has to do with the site. It's the vacancy, the large vacancy in the city. It's an ex-industrial site. And in fact, in a way, the building wants to measure and to make actually this dimension apparent to all the inhabitants of the city and not remain somehow hidden and as it is today. The plan is based on this, it's a very simple plan. It's based on the repetition of this grid 6x6, where in fact these cells are in a way located, and each group of 3 cells is accessible through an individual stair, but the stair, which is slightly bigger than a normal stair for such a building, in order to, in a way, promote visitors and campers to enter into the building, in a way that does not lead just a corridor, but to this place, which in fact could be shared by the 3 cells that in fact are accessible from this blank space. Single unit, this is the section which also is built on the, it has actually the same proportion, it's built on the same 6x6 pattern. The ground floor, as I said, is an attempt to in fact make the site accessible. So on the upper side, through actually this pavilion that was originally given to us, and on the other side, by the way penetrating in the neighborhood of the city. And the ground floor becomes sort of public gallery, which is able to distribute people or visitors either to the new factory, which are now under transformation, or to a series of sports facilities which are being next to the railway tracks. The cell, of course, which is 6x6x6, and meant to be a sort of standard, a place for individual living, can be aggregated in various forms and can actually generate different kind of living units, from the small one, the minimum one for a single person, to the one that are able to accommodate different kind of living, like young small families, couple with an office, couple with employees that come every day to work with them, etc., etc. I will now show some images that we've developed. This is, of course, the single cell with the bed on top of the infrastructural core, which could actually, given the height, the proportion, the height of 6 meters, be somehow divided and offer a kind of small duplex unit, but become also an office with a storage space, or, as I say, the larger house together with an office. And this is the space of collectivity, let's say, which we share, where in fact more collective activities could take place, and which in a way counterbalance the individuality of the life within the cell. An image of the ground floor with the public gallery, and the facade. The facade is extremely simple. It's actually similar to the project of the Baker's sister. Is actually, we have developed a very generic facade, which in fact is somehow hiding on the back a very complex articulation and the possible application of this unit that generate actually a very complex machine, which in fact on the outside is quite simple and generic. The second project that I'd like to show you tonight is a slightly ongoing project that we are working since some months for the city of Brussels, which is the city we are currently based in. And it has to do with, again, the topic of living and working, and especially with the condition of the European border, which is actually a quite probably well-known neighborhood. It's the neighborhood where all the European institutions are located in Brussels, but a neighborhood that, unfortunately, in the last 50 years has been radically transformed, you can see from this area picture, and where actually the 19th century home structure has been radically transformed and destroyed to make space for an incredible amount of office building and office space in the form of large-scale blocks. Actually, it's quite interesting because even today, many office buildings are still being built in the neighborhood, despite the fact that, in fact, when we walk the street of the neighborhood, we see that in fact all this space, or many of these spaces, are vacant or on rent or on sale. In fact, we have actually looked at that a little bit more carefully. We were quite interested by this kind of paradoxical situation. And we have discovered that in fact the building on rent are really quite a lot. and if you look at them in plan, you can see that in fact many of the buildings are either completely vacant or partially vacant and on rent, let's say. So what does it mean? It means that in fact office space are not perhaps anymore the typology that people want to work on in the city, but also the fact that in fact in Brussels office space has been always in a way targeting large companies, large NGO, large corporations. And in fact, actually, if we look at the architecture side of this office building, we recognize clearly a very kind of corporate architectural language. But despite that, in fact, these offices are not able, in fact, to address the rise of this new subject of small-scale companies, of young entrepreneurs that are not able, do not have the capital to enter a market that is not able to, in fact, offer to them anything which is interesting for them. And in fact, Brussels is quite interesting because it's not just actually the city of European institutions and NGO and lobbies, etc., and the capital, of course, of federal state, but it's also something which in the last year has become quite vivid artistic scene, where in fact, and also like perhaps other cities in the world, artists, in this case filmmakers, are in fact living in ex-industries, next industrial buildings, and they can somehow accommodate themselves in very precarious way in order to, for example, in this case, build up kind of warm-up room where to sleep during the cold winter of the place. So it's quite interesting that, in fact, there is not currently present within the contemporary housing market any research or any proposal that try to bypass this dichotomy between living and working space, and that is able actually to foresee a second life for this actually huge amount of stock of office building that we have in the city. Of course, office building like factories are very difficult typology because they've been developed with very deep structure in order to optimize the use, which of course is a little bit at odds with the possibility of living within such a space. Not to say about regulation and building code, which in fact are completely neglecting the possibility of foreseeing space that could be inhabited, that could be lived, that are in a way flexible in order to accommodate the needs of the rising subject. So our proposal that we are currently developing is sort of a project of interior space, which lies at the intersection, I would say, between furniture design and interior design. And what we propose is a sort of inhabitable wall to be placed in the darker place, the darkest side of each of these office buildings, which is able to accommodate and to organize the basic needs of this work. So each of these walls is, in a way, offering a sleeping place, a bathroom, and a kitchen, and a huge amount of storage space. In fact, what we have recognized is that, in fact, this rising subject is a subject that works temporarily in cities, is moving a lot. It has to bring all the time with himself his housing.